Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining me. This is John Einreinhofer bringing you another podcast on West Virginia University basketball. What we're going to do is give you a rundown on WVU's situation heading into the Big 12 Conference Tournament in Kansas City. And then before we close out the podcast, we are going to give you a preview of WVU's matchup with their first-round opponent. The Mountaineers closed their season in impressive fashion, beating the Iowa State Cyclones, a team that had broke back into the top 25 rankings and was on a six-game winning streak, 87-76 at home. The Mountaineers were only up by one at halftime, but came on with a very strong second half, and in front of a raucous crowd on a senior night, true blue game. All the fans dressed in blue at the WVU Coliseum. The Mountaineers ended up winning that one against Iowa State, 87-76, finishing in very strong fashion. Some impressive dunks in that game. I had misspoke earlier. The dunks by Kanate and West, just at under the 10-minute mark of the second half, really changed the momentum of that game. And Daxter Miles Jr. chipped in with 23 points, tying a career high, and an impressive finish to the regular season for the Mountain, who, if they win their Big 12 quarterfinal game, will play on ESPN2 Friday night at 9. Play Friday night on ESPN2 against the number 3 seed Baylor and the number 6 seed Kansas State. The winner of that game is, if West Virginia wins their quarterfinal game, that's who they would play Friday night at 9 on ESPN2. Theoretically, if everything plays out according to form, the Mountaineers would get a rematch of last year's Big 12 tournament final with the Kansas Jayhawks, which would be the objective, of course, for the Mountaineers, avenging last year's Big 12 tournament loss and then also avenging their heartbreaking overtime loss at Kansas last time the two teams played, where the Mountaineers were in control of the game and had a big lead late in the game that they squandered and ultimately lost in overtime. The number 2 seed put the Mountaineers in a position where they would basically be playing the winner of a play-in game between Texas Tech and Texas. The Big 12 officially calls that the first round, but basically it's a play-in. The Mountaineers start in what they call the quarterfinal round, and that obviously gives them an advantage over a team that has to play in a play-in. But recapping things for WVU after the Iowa State win and heading into the Big 12 tournament in Kansas City, Javon Carter was named the Big 12 Defensive Player of the Year. He was also named second team All-Big 12 and first team All-Big 12 defense. Carter, Bob Huggins has called him and Nathan Adrian the Mountaineers' top 2 players. You would think that Carter was a first-team type of performer in the Big 12, but again, the Mountaineers are so balanced and the point guard position is so strong in the Big 12 that Javon Carter had to settle for second-team All-Big 12, but he was named again the Big 12 Defensive Player of the Year and was first-team All-Defense. The Mountaineers finished their regular season with a 24-7 record. That's actually the same record that the Mountaineers had last year. They were 12-6 in the conference this year. Last year they were 11-5, so only one game difference there. As good of a season as they had last year, this team has felt stronger the entire way, I think. It's a little surprising. Sometimes the way you look at it, it's not exactly the way it played out, where actually they had a better in-conference record last year by one game than they did this year. They finished as the number 2 seed in the Big 12 for the tournament when it came around tournament time last year. Also number 2 seed, as I mentioned earlier, this year. Both times Kansas, the number 1 seed. Other awards for the Mountaineers coming out of the Big 12 awards, Nathan Adrian was named to the All-Defensive team. He was named third team All-Big 12. Again, Bob Huggins has referred to him, along with Javon Carter, as the two best players on the Mountaineers squad this year. The the Mountaineers do have a very balanced squad. Nathan Adrian, a player that made tremendous strides and improvement during his 4 years playing for the Mountaineers in Morgantown. And, of course, he is the first person from Morgantown, being a Morgantown High graduate, that earned a basketball scholarship to WVU in over 50 years. Also, rounding out the Big 12 awards for the Mountaineers, Tariq Phillip was named Sixth Man of the Year. He's been a key cog for the Mountaineers all season and his whole time in Morgantown. He is a senior this year. He was, of course, honored along with Nathan Adrian on senior night. And Tariq Phillip also finished his regular season very strong, logging 10 assists against Iowa State. Very impressive performance for Tariq Phillip in the regular season finale for the Mountaineers. Looking to the final regular season polls, the Mountaineers had gone into that last week of the regular season at number 10 in both the AP and the coaches poll. They did pick up a loss at Baylor earlier in the week before they defeated Iowa State. That caused them basically to drop from number 10 in the polls to number 11 in both the AP and the coaches poll. So the regular season polls finished with the Mountaineers 11th. They spent a lot of the season in the top 10, but they finish at 11. Certainly not a bad finish. And there will be another AP poll. Their final poll will come after the conference tournament. So when looking at polls, and for those who are especially concerned with polls, one more poll to go coming up after the conference tournament. So obviously the Mountaineers have a shot to improve that position and finish in the top 10, hopefully even with higher aspirations. Last year, despite their first-round tournament loss to Stephen F. Austin, a season where in the Big 12 tournament they did reach the final before dropping that final to Kansas, they were able to finish number 9 in the AP poll. Other WVU news worthy of note on the basketball front, the WVU women's team won the Big 12 tournament in an amazing tournament run this week. So more good news for the Mountaineers this week, and congratulations to the WVU women's basketball team. Also in WVU's bracket are Iowa State and Oklahoma State. They will play. Iowa State comes in at the 4 seed in the tournament. WVU put them into that position when they defeated them in the regular season finale. And Oklahoma State, who really was a team that made a lot of improvement as the season went on. You look at Oklahoma State, they ended up with a 20-11 record in the regular season. It certainly ended up being a very good season for the Cowboys. They will play Iowa State. The winner of that game will take on the winner of WVU and the Texas winner in the Big 12 semifinals. That'll be Friday night on ESPN2. The Mountaineers opener, 7 p.m. Thursday night, will be broadcast by ESPNU, where they play the winner of that play-in game, which, again, I will preview for you at the close of the podcast here. The Big 12 championship game will be 6 p.m. Saturday on ESPN. One thing I found very interesting to note is the Big 12 started the play-in game, which they're calling the first round, in 2012 in the tourney. Before that, they had that the last two finishers in the conference did not make the tournament. Some stats don't mean much. This stat I do find very interesting to look at because I think it is pretty telling, and it would certainly be a big thing in favor of WVU advancing to the semifinals, and it's this. The winners of the play-in game are 1-9 in the second game they play in the Big 12 tournament with, get this, an average losing margin of 14 points. That's right, you heard that correctly. Winners of the play-in game are 1-9 in the second game of the tournament with an average losing margin of 14 points. Of course, that's no guarantees of what's going to happen. We all know the Big 12 is a highly regarded conference, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But when you're looking at that history since the Big 12 started the play-in game in 2012, things would look very, very good for WVU to make it to that semifinal round Friday night at 9 on ESPN2 against the winner of Iowa State and Oklahoma State. The conventional school of thought, I'm not sure if this means as much as it had in the Big 12, because the Big 12 has gotten very used to West Virginia's press after seeing it so much over the last few years. But the conventional wisdom I'm referring to is that playing a team that had to play a play-in game the day before, when you are very rested and you press like West Virginia does, would help to exploit that tired team coming in off the play-in game. I'm sure that Bob Huggins will be happy to test that theory by pressing on Thursday night. But he has recently gone to more 1-3-1. I think it's especially against Big 12 teams who have seen the press so much that there's been a need to mix it up. But I'm sure that the Mountaineers and Coach Huggins are also getting the rust off that 1-3-1 in case they need it in the NCAA tournament, especially if they advance far enough where there's a team that's got more time to prepare for them and they don't want to just rely on the press being a surprise. Again, conventional wisdom would say if they get through their first round game in the NCAA tournament this year, unlike last year, that then a team that they're playing in game two on the first weekend would not have much time to get ready for that press, and that would give WVU an advantage. In terms of the Mountaineers' schedule, the Big 12 tournament, as mentioned, in Kansas City at the Sprint Center. The Mountaineers landed in Kansas City on Tuesday, and they practiced today. So that is their first practice in Kansas City, and they're waiting the winner of that Texas Tech play-in game that we will have determined before we finish the podcast, and we will preview that game. Coach Huggins has been quoted this week as, and I agree with him, and of course he knows his team better than anyone, but that the Mountaineers are so balanced that they don't have a specific go-to guy that they would be looking to get the ball to at the end of the game, that his players just know that who's ever got the hot hand that night they'll look to get to. They're a very balanced team, and he thinks that'll be a strength. I agree with them. You hear some criticism from some WVU fans, some non-WVU fans, that the flaw of this team may very well be that when they get to the end of a game, a tight game, they've had a lot of tight games this year, a lot of overtime games, and they don't have that one score that you would try to get the ball to. I think that can be overrated. I think if a team doesn't know who you're going to go to, and you have a lot of options, I agree with Coach Huggins that I think it gives the Mountaineers an advantage. This is one stat then that I do find interesting. West Virginia has 5 players averaging between 9.1 points and 12.9 points per game. That's a stat that shows you that balance. I think another strength for the Mountaineers that's almost underrated is that the Mountaineers are a true team in the sense of the word team. There is not that spotlight player that they go to necessarily at the end of the game or has to get his looks or he's not going to be satisfied. This is a very unselfish team. They've moved the ball around even better than they have in past years in the Press Virginia era. I've said it before and I'll say it again. I think that this is the best offensive team that Bob Huggins has had since the Final Four team in 2010. And I think that that's what's going to make this team potentially more dangerous than some of the other more recent West Virginia Mountaineer teams that took Bob Huggins' emphasis on defense and offensive rebounding to heart, but just didn't have the offense and just didn't have the ball movement, had trouble in the half court on offense, things of that nature. This team does not seem to have that much trouble in those areas. In terms of NCAA tournament seeding, looking ahead to the NCAA tournament, because no matter what happens in Kansas City with the Big 12 tournament, a lot of that is for pride. It may not even change the seeding for the Mountaineers. So looking ahead, most experts at this point have them projected as a number 4 NCAA tournament seed. It's been that way for a little while. I don't know if they win the tournament and they beat Kansas. Kansas is the number 1 ranked team in the country. How far can that move them? The experts don't seem to necessarily think that far, despite Kansas being the number 1 team in the country. But we won't know that until Sunday night. Maybe the Mountaineers can still move themselves up. If they go out early, do they lose a 4 seed? I don't know if a first-round loss costs them that or not at this point. Maybe it could cost them a spot. One thing, if you're a Big 12 fan, of course, first, as a West Virginia fan, for all the West Virginia Big 12 fans, you want to see West Virginia go the furthest and represent the Big 12 the best in the NCAA tournament. But as a fan of the Big 12, if your team's in that conference, like West Virginia is, you'd like to see the conference do well. And what's been disappointing in recent years in the NCAA tournament is that the Big 12 has been very highly regarded during the regular season. It gets talked about all year, and the NCAA tournament performance has not been all that great. One theory that I like, if you want to be an optimist about the Big 12, is the quality of point guards in the Big 12. I mentioned earlier in the podcast that Javon Carter was second team Big 12, and he's arguably the Mountaineers' best player. He's had a very, very solid season. He was Defensive Player of the Year in the Big 12. But one of the reasons for that is because the Big 12 is filled with elite point guards, and this could bode well for them in the NCAA tournament. That's a theory that I like and I hope is correct this year as a West Virginia and a Big 12 fan. Frank Mason III, Kansas, point guard, Big 12 Player of the Year. That's what he got out of those awards this week. Monte Morris, Iowa State, saw him last week in Morgantown. Very impressive player. He was the Big 12 preseason Player of the Year. He's also first team Big 12 along with Frank Mason III. And Jawan Evans of Oklahoma State, also a point guard who made first team All Big 12. And then, of course, the Mountaineers' own Javon Carter, Defensive Player of the Year. He can score. He can pass. Player that just does a lot of things for you. Very, very valuable player. Hopefully, all these top point guards will help the Big 12 make a good run in the NCAA tournament. One basketball theory that I've always agreed with, if you want to start with the very basics, get a team that's got a good point guard and a good big man, and that's a team that has a chance to go a long way and do a lot of damage at any level of basketball and even at the highest levels. I think it's true. So hopefully these top point guards will help the Big 12 make some noise in the NCAA tournament. I had misspoke earlier. If West Virginia, in fact, wins their quarterfinal matchup, they will play on ESPN2 Friday night at 9 p.m. against the winner of number 3 seeded Baylor and number 6 seeded Kansas State. That is their side of the bracket. Oklahoma State and Iowa State will play, but they are on Kansas's side of the bracket. Worthy of note, West Virginia's only other Division I basketball team won the first round of their conference tournament in Conference USA. Marshall, the Thundering Herd, defeated Florida Atlantic 89-74. They'll play Old Dominion in the next round of the Conference USA tournament. Well, West Virginia got their first break of the Big 12 tournament, and they haven't even played their first game yet, as Texas, with a wild 30-10 run in the second half, has upset Texas Tech 61-52. So Texas will be the Mountaineers' quarterfinal opponent in the Big 12 tournament. Texas only 11-21 on the season, having a horribly disappointing season under Coach Shaka Smart, although they do have a young team and they have a potential NBA player, a certain first-round draft pick in Jarrett Allen. Texas, tonight, that was their first win away from home in their victory against Texas Tech in the first round of the Big 12 tournament. Texas was 0-11 away from home in true road games. They pick up the win 61-52 in the upset over Texas Tech. And Texas Tech had split their series with WVU on the season, beating them in Lubbock, and the Mountaineers had to go into multiple overtime periods to defeat them in Morgantown. So no guarantees, of course, as the cliche goes, but the Mountaineers certainly catching a break as they'll play the number 10 seed Texas in the quarterfinal round, and you don't want to get too greedy. But with that understood, the Mountaineers getting rest up to this point, Texas is going to be a tired team tomorrow. If the Mountaineers can handle them with relative ease, that'll put them in even better shape to face the winner of Baylor and Kansas State on Friday night. The Mountaineers also got Issa Ahmad back for the final game of the regular season after he missed 3 games. Of course, they're a balanced team, but he's one of their top players. He's 6'8". He can do a lot of different things on the offensive and the defensive end of the court, and he should be back much closer to full strength for the game against Texas. That will be a game on ESPNU Thursday night at 7 o'clock, the early game, so to speak, of the evening contest. And then it'll be on to, with a victory, ESPN2 on Friday night at 9 o'clock against the winner of Baylor and Kansas State. The Mountaineers did sweep Texas during the regular season. It was a 77-62 win for the Mountaineers over the Longhorns in Morgantown on February 20th. That was a game in which Lamont West scored 23 points and connected on 6 3-pointers. He was very hot that game. He's been a little bit cooler lately. It would be great if he could have a repeat performance or something even similar against Texas this time around. Javon Carter, of course, one of the Mountaineers' top players, scored a season-high 24 points against the Longhorns in the last meeting between WVU and Texas. That'll do it for the podcast looking at the West Virginia University Mountaineers basketball team here in the Big 12 tournament. Quarterfinal game against Texas. Then the winner of that game will play in a semifinal game against the winner of Kansas State and Baylor on Friday night. Thanks for joining us. This is John Einreinhofer reporting on WVU basketball for the Big 12 tournament. John Einreinhofer, thank you for joining us for West Virginia University basketball.